Another basement, another Die Hard review? How can the same thing happen to the same guy twice? So since we're coming up on the Christmas holidays, I thought it would be a perfect time to start my series of Christmas movie reviews this year. Certain ones that I think would be a good fit, especially considering the anniversary dates, if you will. I did some of that earlier this year with Jaws and Batman Begins. But today, let's start off with the sequel to one of the most successful and iconic action films of all time, Die Hard 2, with Bruce Willis returning as the main character John McClane and various other people. 2 years after the events of Nakatomi Plaza, John McClane is at Dulles International Airport waiting for his wife's plane to land. While he's waiting, he catches wind of a terrorist group that takes control of the air control system at the airport, one of the planes having his wife on board. So now he's trying to figure out a way to stop them from doing what they're doing and trying to convince the personnel at the airport of what's going on. 2 years ago, I did a review of the first Die Hard, which for those of you who don't know, Die Hard is... to say an action classic, that's kind of an understatement. But really, it's a really, really great movie, especially in the action genre. And considering that movie's success, it was kind of inevitable, I guess, on retrospect, that there was going to be a sequel of some kind. When it comes to Die Hard sequels, this one doesn't really get talked about as much. When people think of Die Hard sequels, they tend to think of 3, 4, and the 5th one. The second one kind of fades into the background in comparison. I always thought it was kind of an enjoyable movie, not quite as good as the first one, and after watching it last night, I'd say it's fine. It's not awful, but not great necessarily. It's a huge, huge step down from the first one. For starters, Rennie Harlan takes over the director's chair as opposed to John McTiernan. And the setting is in an airport where there's thousands and thousands of people in the middle of Christmas, similar to the first one where it's set on Christmas Eve. Well, the difference is, the threat's a lot more bigger this time around. And there's really not that much to the characters as opposed to the first one, where you actually get to learn a little bit about John McClane as a person, seeing that he's scared of heights, he's having trouble with his marriage, he hasn't really seen his children for a while, and he sees the error of his ways in the midst of a crazy situation that he was in. This one, it's basically an entertaining action movie with some really good moments and some really good parts. And I'll give the movie this. John McClane still feels like John McClane in this one. Bruce Willis is still great as the character. He's the everyman, he's the regular guy that we feel like we can all be in that situation. The thing that I think really drags the movie down is that the stakes that are involved. On the one hand, you got a bunch of planes flying overhead with the terrorists that are taking control of it, and at any moment, they could crash them into the ground, and many people, including John's wife, could die. But at the same time, though, it feels like a bit of an overreach, because the first film, you're in one specific small location, very self-contained, in a skyscraper 30 stories high, and John McClane's the only person in the building that's going to screw everything up. And you get that in here too, which is really fun to see. But in this one, you get about 15,000 people, whatever that guy says, in the control tower. It almost feels like too much of an overreach, in my book at least. And I think some people feel the same way too, but I've always felt that way also. As far as the look and feel, it definitely feels like, in a way, John McTiernan did make this movie, even if there really isn't a whole lot of innovative stuff in here. The action is fairly entertaining, and there's some blood in here, particularly when John stabs a guy in the eye with an icicle. Yeah, don't show your kids that. Just don't. The Annex Skywalk shootout is probably the best part of the movie as far as action goes. And also at the climax, the confrontation between John and Colonel Stewart and the one soldier that's in on the conspiracy with the terrorists. But there's just some things in this movie that, to be honest, kind of bugged me, and now that I'm older, it really, really is more evident. Particularly bringing back Richard Thornburg from the first movie. He has a more extensive role in here where he sees Holly on the plane, and apparently he filed a court order against her. They go at each other, snarking at each other, and he's trying to figure out what exactly is keeping them in the air for so long. They focus way too much on that, and it drags the movie down considerably. I also like the fact that when they turn on the TV on the planes, it's an actual episode of The Simpsons. Since this is 1990, it was the early years of that show. And then there's also this old lady sitting next to Holly. She also has a taser in her purse. How does she get that past security? 1990, long before 9/11. And I also find it kind of cool with some of the actors that show up in here, like Robert Costanzo, who was the voice of Harvey Bullock in the Batman animated series. Mark Boone Jr., Detective Flass from Batman Begins, is also in here. John Leguizamo. Robert Patrick is also in here too, briefly. Hey, what do I look like to you? A sitting duck. Pfft. And Reginald VelJohnson as Sergeant Al Powell shows up, although very briefly. I wish he had more to do in this one, but they are far away on different sides of the country, so I get it. But still, he was such a great addition in the first one, and it's sad that this is his last appearance in the series. I wish he came around again later on. But then there's certain characters that really, really get under my skin, particularly Captain Carmine Lorenzo, played by Dennis Franz. You might know him as Andy Sipowicz from the show NYPD Blue. And Carmine Lorenzo is basically Andy Sipowicz in this movie if he was allowed to drop the F-bomb. The only difference being, he's kind of a jerk in this one and just really obnoxious. And one of the biggest egos I've ever seen, always boasting about being the best airport security team on the planet when even though it's ironic that they turned out to be the worst one. You want something, you got it. Although I do like it when he teams up with McClane finally, when he's finally convinced of what's happening, after spending the whole movie rejecting him at every single turn. Then there's the villain, Colonel Stewart, played by William Sadler. Not the most memorable villain in the series, but far from the worst. I don't mean to constantly compare this to Die Hard 5, but the villain in Die Hard 5, oh, please. I'd rather take Colonel Stewart any day of the week. William Sadler plays the part fine, and I'll give him this. He really, really nails the look and attitude of a really hardened military veteran. Served in the military for 6 years. I met a few soldiers who were like that. Nowhere near as interesting as Hans Gruber, and especially Jeremy Irons in Die Hard 3. He has some interactions with John McClane, but it's very quick and doesn't really go on that long. In fact, they don't really have any interactions with each other over the walkie-talkie, and John McClane's always trying to catch up to them. So in a way, it's a nice change of pace for the hero-villain dynamic in this one. Basically, his plot is to try to free this foreign general Esperanza and take him to a place where there's no extradition. But like I said earlier, John McClane is still John McClane in this movie. A lot of people like to talk about him as a guy who spouts out one-liners and makes wisecracking jokes all the time, and the famous catchphrase, yippee-ki-yay, mother, well, you know. One thing that this movie really, really does well is the scene where John tries to get the plane to land properly after it crashes onto the runway. That scene was handled so well, and when I watched it as a kid for the first time, I went, my God, they went for it. Holy crap! And seeing John's reaction to it is a perfect example of what makes this character so endearing. He's a good cop who cares about other people and wants to help other people, and when he's not able to, that crushes him. But I do like seeing the smart-ass side of Bruce Willis because it reminds me a lot of my uncle, who's a cop in New York City, who, oddly enough, John McClane is also a cop in New York, although LA in this one. Watching Bruce Willis in any movie that he's done, well, particularly his older films as of late, not so much, but anyway, I swear to God, I felt like I was watching my uncle talk with other people. To my uncle, if you're somehow watching this, I mean it as a compliment, I promise.
Freedom. Not yet.
Can't believe this. After months of planning, you can't anticipate one cop? So gratifying to see the villain get so irritated whenever the hero messes it up for them. I just eat it all up. It's so great, especially when it comes to John McClane. Oh yeah, real quick, the scene where all the grenades are thrown into the cockpit and McClane somehow manages to get out after about 30 seconds when the grenades don't go off. Okay, I'm not the only one who says this, but really, come on. You pull out a fuse on a grenade, you got about 5 seconds before that thing goes off. I know because I was in the army and I threw a grenade. They don't last longer than 5 seconds when you pull the pin. I also kind of like the idea of the Special Forces team being in on the terrorist plot from the beginning, and there's little hints that are thrown throughout the movie where you can kind of go, wait a minute, something's off here. And then when it's revealed, it's like, okay, that makes sense. But in a way, it does feel kind of sudden. I don't really know. It just wasn't as effective as I think that they were trying to make it. Still, it's a cool idea though. So eventually, John manages to blow up the plane and stop the terrorists from leaving the airport by causing the fuel to drip out of the wing, lights up the fuel, and then leads to the plane and then explodes, which also gives a perfect landing opportunity for the plane circling above. And his parking ticket gets revoked by Carmine Lorenzo, and all is right with the world. As far as Die Hard movies go, this is definitely not the greatest in the series. A bit of an overstretch with the stakes involved with the terrorist plot, which isn't really as interesting as what we saw in the previous film. But at the very least, you still get Bruce Willis as John McClane, which thankfully this movie still retains the core of the character. So those are my thoughts on Die Hard 2. What are you guys' thoughts on the movie? Do you love it, like it, think it's alright, or do you hate it? Whatever the case is, comment below and tell me your thoughts. Stay tuned for more Christmas movie reviews, and I'll see you all very soon.